This is a video about YouTuber Black Pigeon Speaks, and in particular, his video entitled Why Women Destroy Nations/Civilizations and Other Uncomfortable Truths. No prizes for guessing what this one's about. If women's sexual preferences are liberated and go unchecked, they destroy civilizations. If women are allowed to choose, harems form. If women are allowed a voice in matters that pertain to the safety of a nation, then that nation will die inevitably. And quite helpfully, Black Pigeon kicks off his video by laying out a list of his arguments. As this is a complicated subject, let me state briefly what I'm talking about in this video so you can follow along more closely. Women do not, on an instinctual level, care very much about her tribe, nation, or civilization. It's in their nature not to. Women are biological creatures, like all others, and they seek to maximize their chances of having viable offspring. This half-century-long experiment of women's liberation and political enfranchisement has ended in disaster for the West. And the damage done to the West may be irreparable, and the only solution would be a return to a more patriarchal society, and this seems highly unlikely. So, right off the bat there, we've got some extraordinary claims, and as we know, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So we're going to go through Black Pigeon's video and take a look at the evidence behind these arguments. And as always, I'd encourage you to also watch Black Pigeon's video so you can be sure that I'm not misrepresenting his arguments. Now then, first up, we're going to look at his claim that women are inherently disloyal, and this is explained in the section of his video entitled Betrayal. And let's get this out in the open. Women are not very good at being loyal to the tribe. They never have been, they never will be. The reason is it's not in their nature to do so. Women throughout history have shown time and time again they're quick to seek the favors of men they feel are stronger and more dominant, whether they be part of their in-group or not. Recent examples of this besides Japanese or Vietnamese war brides come from Europe and are illustrated by the countless numbers of Belgian, French, Dutch, what have you women that took up relations with occupying German military personnel. And this was only a short time ago, but when Nazis were defeated and social stability was restored, they were punished for their betrayal and transgressions against their people. So for the argument that women are not loyal to their society or culture, Black Pigeon offers the evidence that some women sleep with, marry, or otherwise aid enemies of their country after it's been defeated in war. And this is because women are, quote, quick to seek the favors of men who are stronger or more dominant. And there's a few problems with this, but let's start at the beginning. Now the first news story that Black Pigeon uses is entitled The Japanese Woman Who Married the Enemy. And it's about Japanese women who met and married American soldiers after the surrender of Japan in the Second World War. And it quotes a Japanese woman who offers her reasons for doing so. Everything was crumbled as a result of the US bombing. You couldn't find streets or stores. It was a nightmare. We were struggling for food and lodging. I didn't know very much about Bill, his background or family, but I took a chance when he asked me to marry him. But very much. I couldn't live there. I had to get out to survive. Now nowhere does she say that she was enamored by how strong or dominant Bill was. Her choice was to marry Bill or possibly starve to death. You know, Tokyo was pretty much totally destroyed at the end of the Second World War, and she married an American soldier to, you know, not D. And this point is echoed in the Daily Mail article that Black Pigeon cites talking about French women who worked as prostitutes for occupying German soldiers. Yet not all of the women had been prostitutes before the war. Some had been respectable housewives and mothers and claimed they were prostituting themselves only to eat. Now, also, Black Pigeon, it takes two to tango, if you know what I mean. For every woman who sleeps with or marries an enemy, does that not also require a man to sleep with or marry an enemy? Why are you only taking woman to task for this? You know, by the same logic, that means women are disloyal if they shack up with an enemy. Aren't men just as disloyal for doing the same? Also, a lot of these women didn't have a choice. They were just trying to survive in hard times. But the men had a choice. You know, American men didn't have to marry Japanese women. They just did it because they wanted to. And, of course, some men go further than just sleeping with or marrying the enemy. Sometimes they fight for them. One of the last German units to see action in World War I was the 33rd Waffen Grenadier Division, which participated in the defense of central Berlin, and that was comprised of French volunteers. And since Black Pigeon mentioned punishment after the fact, the leader of the French volunteers during the defense of Berlin was sentenced to 20 years hard labor. Others were imprisoned, and some were just shot upon being captured by the French. And of course, some Japanese people fought for America in the Second World War. The 442nd Infantry Regiment of the United States Army was made up almost entirely of soldiers of Japanese ancestry, and they were one of the most decorated units in American military history. So why don't the actions of these men prove that it's not in the nature of men to be loyal to their tribe? Black Pigeon is really holding men and women to different standards here. And speaking of that, now, not only are women not punished for inviting alien and unassimilable armies of men into the West, they then vote for parties that force the entire society to have its national wealth redistributed to this army of aggressive and hostile men. Now, first off, just because you have a photograph of some woman holding a refugee's welcome sign doesn't mean that that sentiment is unique to women. Secondly, just a minor pet peeve of mine, but I hate that when people talk about immigrants disparagingly, they only ever say men. You know, look at this clip. There's men, there's women, there's children, there's all sorts of people. And the United Nations data on Syrian refugees puts the gender split at around 50-50. And of course, a large percentage of those are children. It's hardly an army. Black Pigeons just only saying men because he thinks men are scarier. I guess. And I'm specifically talking about Syria here, because the image that Black Pigeon used was a free woman welcoming Syrian refugees to Munich. And here's a video of the event, and you can see the sign in the background there. And look at this evil invading army of, like, regular families and children and elderly women. It's hardly the Nazis coming over the hill. Also, how do these women at all relate to the earlier point about women seeking the favor of stronger and more dominant men? You know, a refugee fleeing a failed state doesn't exactly scream dominant alpha male at me. I just don't really see the comparison between these women and prostitutes in occupied France. The entire basis of Western society was the male agreement to keep only one woman in public, so that every male has near equal chance at reproduction. It's for this reason that organized and advanced civilizations have always needed to agree on the equitable distribution of women, so as to incentivize its men to produce and to have a stake in the society's health and security. But this, like other cultural arrangements that held the West together for centuries, is breaking down and can be observed in something as basic as the fact there are no Western countries that are even at replacement levels in their birth rates. This again can be laid at the feet of loosening of sexual morality and the dating habits of young women. Now, I couldn't find exactly where Black Pigeon found this particular fertility rate graph, but I saw the World Bank source down the bottom there. So we went to the World Bank website and had a look at their data. And they've got a neat little graph-making feature. So we first recreated the graph in Black Pigeon's video using those countries and date ranges. And as you can see, the graphs is the same. So the first thing to note here that the fall of the fertility rate since the 1960s is not specific to Western countries. If we add in the worldwide average, we can see that over the specified date range, that's falling too. And the next thing to note is that the World Bank data only goes back to 1960, which is just far enough to catch the post-World War baby boom. Now, I'm not gonna go into that much right now, but for those who don't know, people tended to postpone starting families during World War II, if possible. You know, the economy's terrible, the Nazis are invading, all the men are off fighting. It's a bad time to have kids. But once the war's over, you know everyone gets back to the baby making. Then once everyone who wants kids has had kids, there's generally a drop in the fertility rate because the new generation that was born isn't old enough to have their own kids for a couple of decades. And this is why you see the birth rate stabilize around 1980. If we cut the boom out and only look at the data from 1980 onwards, we see that the birth rates in those Western countries have actually been trending very slightly upwards. And they re much closer today to the worldwide average, which is still falling. Another point here is that by selecting certain countries and certain date ranges, you can basically make whatever point you like. And let's look at a few countries where the majority of people are Muslims and, oh God, would you look at that? The birth rates are plummeting off a cliff. Islam must be dying out pretty soon. There'll be no Muslims left at all. Also, one thing to understand is that female psychology has always been about adaptation. In our tribal past, if women of conquered tribes didn't submit to their new masters, they faced death along with their husbands, brothers, sons, fathers. Even today, many women seek out aggressive men, whether consciously or not, as it seems that this psychology has been ground into women after countless years of our species' evolution. That means criminals, gangsters, and mass murderers are always going to be more attractive to women than hard-working, honest men. They always have been. They always will be. Now, I want to deny that a certain number of people are attracted to that sort of notoriety, but I guarantee But you ask the average woman if she'd rather marry an average, honest, hard-working guy or Charles fucking Manson. She's gonna pick the guy without the swastika tattoo on his forehead. Black Pigeon is again viewing the actions of a very small minority of women as representative of all women. Now, I don't have any studies for this on hand, but I did ask for women who we know personally if they'd rather marry a completely average man or Charles Manson. And they all said some variant of the sentence, "Why the fuck would I ever marry Charles Manson?" And that's anecdotal evidence, sure, but I am willing to bet it generally holds true for most women. The culture of the sensitive man, the emotional man, the compassionate man is at odds with what women are biologically predisposed to desire. Young women, if they tell you the truth, are drawn to the scoundrel, not the impeccable gentleman with the perfectly manicured fingernails. I'm afraid. You trembling. I'm not trembling. You like me because I'm a scoundrel. You not a scoundrel in your life. I happen to like nice men. I'm a nice man. Very nice. Okay, that's a movie, dude. You know, come on. Don, cite a movie as your basis for claims about women's biological impulses. But to laughingly take this somewhat seriously for a moment, I'm gonna bet quite a lot of women's attraction to Han Solo is mainly because he looks like Harrison Ford in the 80s. You know, the Emperor is certainly more of a dominant alpha male than Han, but I don't see many women pining after him, oddly enough. However, we all remember Leah's classic line after she meets Grand Moff Tarkin, where she says, "So who knows, maybe Black Pigeon is onto something here. Let's move on." It's so much a part of woman's psyche to want the scoundrel that it's wrapped up in their very knot. Just to get this out of the way, because I have a feeling it might show up in the comments. Yes, I am aware that the vast majority of women, when raped, reach sexual climhuo. Oh, hang on. I'm not touching this bit. Let's move further on. Once women were given equal say in the sphere of politics, it was only a matter of time until our civilization was swept up by the event horizon of its own collapse. All kinds of studies have been done on this subject, as this one from Columbia University, and they all, without exception, note that as women become more quote-unquote emancipated, the decline of the family is further accelerated. And as the family disintegrates and women move politically further and further to the left in their voting, many then begin to use the government as a surrogate husband and provider. So here, Black Pigeon is arguing that women are moving further and further to the left in their voting. But let's take a look at his sources here. First, the study, entitled "Why Have Women Become Left-Wing?", which is looking at the reasons that more women than men in the United States vote for the Democrats. And in particular, it's looking at why the gender gap has been widening over the last few decades. Now, if you just read the headline, you might get the sense that men occupy some sort of fixed political position, and the gender gap is only caused by women moving to the left. But if you read the study, it also mentions the inverse of that, which is men moving further to the right to support the Republicans. And this is something that Black Pigeon, next source, goes into in more detail. This headline, "Why do women vote differently than men?" is from Slate. And this is some excellent tactical cropping from Black Pigeon here, because if we scroll down just an inch, we can read the subheader. Despite stereotypes, men are actually more fickle at the voting booth. And this article argues that it's men moving to the right, more so than women moving to the left, that is responsible for the gender gap. And I quote, "So did women move away from Reagan and his party in disgust?" No. Rather, women's emerging belief in their own political entitlement permitted them to stay right where they were. Reagan struck a chord with men, So men moved in a more Republican direction while women stayed put. Kaufman of the University of Maryland has looked at long-term election study data from 1952 to 2004 and observed that men's support for the Democratic Party declined from the mid-70s through the 8 years of Reagan's presidency and has remained at that lower level with small fluctuations ever since. In contrast, she writes, and this isn't me going out and looking for some source to contradict Black Pigeon's claims here. This article is in his video. Well, the headline is anyway. And let's look at the next headline. Women today have a new husband. They have a new husband. And this is from the website thepromolmail.com. Oh, not a publication I'd heard of. And what does this article have to say about women and the government? Yikes. And this website has some other interesting articles, like, oh, friendship with women is unnatural, modern women's contempt for men, oh, what it feels like to be a nihilist, in which the author states, geez, it sounds like someone doesn't have any loyalty for his tribe. Now then, apologies for the length of this next clip, but it does represent the main source behind Black Pigeon's arguments, so we gonna have to watch all of it, I'm afraid. In one of the most comprehensive studies of civilizational decline, J. Unwin postulates in his book, Sex and Culture, written in 1934, Unwin, a British racial anthropologist at Oxford and Cambridge universities, studied 86 different cultures through 5,000 years of history and found a positive correlation between the cultural achievement of a people and the sexual, civil, social, Unwin's impetus for the project was to test the Freudian theory that civilizational progress was the product of repressed sexuality. He found that discipline in sexual matters appropriated social energy to more civilizational ends. It's so very complicated, but for Unwin, the fabric of society was primarily sexual, and heterosexual monogamy was the optimal arrangement for the planning, building, protecting, and nurturing of the family. If enough heterosexual partners made a monogamous commitment, civilizational energy was directed toward promoting the finest societal foundation possible. Without exception, each civilization he studied allowed its success to alter its moral code. According to Unwin, after a nation becomes increasingly liberal with regards to its sexual morality, it loses its cohesion, its impetus, and its purpose. From a chaste moral code, societies gain what he called expansive energy, and this energy allowed these cultures to expand into other weaker cultures. Okay, so let's talk about Jed Unwin. Now, When someone first recommended I make a video about Black Pigeon, this Why Women Destroy Civilizations video was the first one he clicked on. And before I watched it, I thought, oh well, this will be easy. He'll obviously at some point list some example civilizations that have been destroyed by women, and then I can just counter those. You know, for example, I imagined at some point Black Pigeon would say something like, women's rights destroyed the Roman Empire, and then I could just list off a bunch of reasons that the Roman Empire actually collapsed and make him seem foolish for oversimplifying it and pinning everything just on women. So that was me plan going into this. However, as you may have noticed by now, Black Pigeon has not directly mentioned even one actual civilization that's collapsed because of women's rights. And nor does he ever actually in the entire video. The only examples he gives are indirect. He says that this Jed Unwin guy found a bunch of civilizations that were destroyed by women's rights. So I thought, okay, new plan. To get a concrete example here, what I'm gonna have to do is go and read Sex and Culture by Jed Unwin, get to the bit where he says women's rights destroyed the Roman Empire or something like that, and then I can counter that and, by proxy, prove Black Pigeon wrong. So I went and read Sex and Culture by Jed Unwin, and as I read it, I realized I'd made two very amateur mistakes, but we'll get back to those in a little while. First, let's talk about Unwin's book. Now, if you search online for Jed Unwin, you mainly only find him and his book mentioned in the same terms that Black Pigeon is presenting it here. Unwin seems to be quite popular in alt-right circles as someone who predicted that feminism will destroy the West. But is that what his book actually says? Well, let's take a look. So, by and large, Black Pigeon does initially give a fair representation of Unwin's general argument. Unwin looked at a bunch of different cultures and civilizations and sorted them into a hierarchy, the exact specifics of which aren't terribly relevant for Vichy right now, but generally the top of the scale represents more, quote, advanced and civilized societies, and the bottom of the scale, the less advanced and less civilized. Now, what Unwin found was that societies nearer the top of his scale tended to have more restrictive sexual norms than the societies lower on the scale. Unwin also sees everything in terms of energy, you know, expansive energy for a society to expand its territory, creative energy to invent new things, and so on. And he argues that societies further up the scale have more energy than those lower on the scale. And beyond just proving the correlation, Unwin argues that the restricted sexual norms are the cause of the increased societal energy, and he thinks that if sexual relations are too easy to attain, then our society will lose its energy. I mean, basically, his argument is this. Did you notice what went wrong in that scene? Ordinarily, Billy would work hard to make money with his paper route. Then he'd use the money to buy dinner for Mavis, thus earning a slim chance to perform the reproductive act. But in a world where teens can date robots, why should he bother? Why should anyone bother? Let's take a look at Billy's Planet a year later. Where are all the football stars? And where are the biochemists? They trapped in the soft vice-like grip of robot lips. All civilization was just an effort to impress the opposite sex, with robots being a stand-in for easy access to sex there. use. So there you go. You are now up to speed on Jed Unwin's Sex and Culture. So what do we think of his argument? Well, just personally, I think that, beyond being too quick to discard examples that go against his hypothesis, Unwin generally proves the correlation between restricted sexual norms and the advancement of civilization just fine. But I'm not sold on it being causative. In my opinion, For a society to actually be able to enforce sexual norms generally has to have things like a strong government, a legal system capable of imposing punishments, usually a state religion to provide some religious justification. And a society which has these things is typically gonna find itself near at the top of Unwin's list anyway. So I'd say restricted sexual norms just tend to go hand in hand with the advancement of civilization rather than being the direct cause of it. Now, I tend to agree with Aldous Huxley's view of Unwin. I tend to think I will who thought Sex and Culture was a very significant work, but that Unwin was guilty of oversimplification. And this quote is taken from Huxley's introduction to Unwin's posthumously published follow-up to Sex and Culture, which we'll get to later. This oversimplification is twofold. There is what may be called the extensional oversimplification, which consists in the omission to consider all the significant factors existing at a given time. And there is a temporal oversimplification, which is the failure to take into account the occasional and unpredictable emergence into actuality of entirely new entities. It's a mouthful. Now, what Huxley's saying there, basically, is Unwin misses a lot of shit out. And he goes on to name a ton of things that represent an equal or greater effect on a society's success than the particular restrictiveness of its sexual norms. You know, agricultural and technological advancement, religion, nutrition, warfare, scientific discovery, diplomacy, and so on. For Huxley, focusing too much on one specific societal element, like Unwin does with sexual norms, want to give you the full picture of how a society works. And Huxley also raises another excellent point when he asks, do the conditions which make for a display of maximum energy also and automatically make for a display of the best kind of energy? Are the most energetic individuals and societies necessarily the most kindly, forbearing, and peaceable? And this is a very good question. I mean, Nazi Germany certainly had a lot of expansive and creative energy. No one can deny that. It had so much expansive energy, in fact, that it got itself destroyed. Now, before we get back to Black Pigeon, I just want to make one more note about Unwin. In Sex and Culture, he was approaching the issue strictly as a scientist. For him, human civilizations are deterministic. He makes no moral judgments, and aside from a few sentences in his conclusion, he offers no political guidance. In his later work, entitled Hyposia, however, he creates an imaginary country called Hyposia, which has all the elements which for him would allow the society to be the most energetic and productive for the longest possible time. So by reading that book, we can get a picture of exactly the sort of society that Unwin would want. But we'll get back to that shortly. For now, let's return to Black Pigeon. Now, when you compare the modern Western world with the Islamic one, you see exactly the results that Unwin's theory would predict. By allowing woman to fuck freely, by allowing woman to fuck freely. Who? The mask slipped a bit there, dude. I don't think I can say the word fuck with that level of venom. By allowing woman to fuck freely, to freely, Oh, by allowing woman to fuck freely, the West has de facto entered a matriarchy that disincentivizes young men. Islam, on the other hand, keeps their women chaste, and their expansive energy, as Unwin's theory predicts, is manifested in what we re-observing today. The Islamic culture is the one who's expanding into the West. Okay, so a brief point here. Syrian refugees are some people fleeing a war zone. People Syrian fleeing They are not an organized army. I can think of several instances, from a lifetime even, when the West has been the invading armed force in a lot of Islamic countries. I mean, in my lifetime, the United States actually invaded Iraq and took over the government. They took over the But let's look at Unwin's hypothetical country of Hyposia and see how that would treat immigrants. Another important part of a society's existence is its contact with other societies. In a sluggish, uncivilized society, strangers are feared greatly, not because there is anything objectively fearsome about them, but because they are strange, unusual beings who behave and speak in strange, unusual ways. And this attitude toward strangers is also apparent among the less cultured members of an energetic society, who will not have anything to do with a foreigner if they can help it. Even in a rationalistic society, strangers are seldom treated in the same way as natives, and in Hyposia, the duty of maintaining a sympathetic relation with other societies will be allotted to special men. You see, Unwin likes energy and diversity of people, of thought, of whatever for him is more energetic. He doesn't want culture to stay the same. He wants it to change and adapt to new circumstances. So enough about Jed Unwin for now. Let's talk about Sweden. The total and complete feminization of Sweden and its men have allowed their women to invite their country's own destruction through the importation of millions of unassimilatable and aggressive people from completely alien cultures. Not only are they borrowing money to fund the colonization of their country, but they are now even creating gender imbalances that will have severe and lasting repercussions on their society's future. So something about that last source there seemed a little off to me. Not only does it appear to have been written by someone called Fuzzy Slippers, the claim seems a little suspect. A worse gender imbalance than China. Really? Well, let's investigate. So this headline comes from a conservative website called legalinsurrection.com, and in it, Fuzzy Slippers is giving their interpretation of a January 2016 big story entitled "Why Does Sweden Have More Boys Than Girls?" So the first thing to note here is that the data in this news story specifically looks at 16 and 17-year-olds, which is of course not mentioned by Black Pigeon in his video. Now then, normally, on average, there are 105 boys born for every 100 girls, and in Sweden in 2014, there were 108 boys for every 100 girls. So that's hardly that dramatic of a difference so far. Now, in China, there are 117 boys to every 100 girls in that age range. So what's going on here? In just 1 year, how has the average number of boys in that age range in Sweden jumped higher than China? Or at least how has it appeared to have jumped higher than China? Well, if we look at this graph from the article, we see that the vast majority of asylum applicants are males in that age range. So why is that? Whoa, what is that? Why? Well, according to this news story anyway, it's to do with a particular right to family reunification that they have in Sweden. It seems like if you apply for asylum in Sweden before you re 18 and you re successful, you can then apply for family reunification and your family can get in on your residency permit. Now, that's obviously quite an attractive prospect for a lot of people, and it does explain why there's such a high number of male applicants in that age range. I'm saying applicants because that's all they are at this point. They've applied for asylum. Now, the large gender imbalance cited by Legal Insurrection comes from an estimate by Valerie Hudson of Texas A&M University, and there's something very important to note here. Her estimate was made under the assumption that every single asylum applicant would be granted a residency permit, which, to put it lightly, is not very realistic. Although, I admit, I'm cheating a bit here by writing this 10 months in the future, where I know that Sweden rejected half of the asylum seekers who applied in 2015. Hindsight is 2020, as they say. The second thing to note here is that these 16 and 17-year-olds were applying so disproportionately for asylum in Sweden so that they could use the right to reunification to get their families in. Now, I doubt that Black Pigeon would be too happy about that, to be honest, but what it does mean is, even if they did all get in, the gender imbalance stats no longer check out. Because if a teenager is successful in his asylum application, and then he invites his mom and his gran and auntie and 3 sisters over, the gender imbalance disappears. Sweden does not have a gender imbalance worse than China. There are more women than men in Sweden. For this headline to make any sense at all, you first have to only be talking about 16 and 17-year-olds. Then you have to assume that every single male applicant for asylum will get in, and then you have to assume that they will not take advantage of the right to family reunification. which seems to be the reason they were applying there in the first place. You know, I'm really glad I don't go in for all this anti-immigrant stuff myself. I tie myself in knots trying to make it all make sense. And they await their doom with smiles of tolerance and passivity, calm as Hindu cows. Oh, fuck off with that Tyler Durden bullshit. Looking again at Unwin's work, he leaves us with a stark dilemma. It may not be possible to save the West. According to his model, this process is irreversible, and the only way to do so would be to restrict the sexual freedom of Western women and move back to a more patriarchal society. And here's where Black Pigeon really fucks it all up good and proper. He says that to save the West, according to Unwin's model, we have to return to a patriarchal society. So before we address this point, do you remember earlier when I said I made two amateur mistakes before reading Unwin's book? Well, here they are. Firstly, I assumed that Black Pigeon was giving a fair representation of Unwin's work and opinions. And secondly, I assumed that since this book is his primary source in the video, that Black Pigeon had actually read the book. So first off, let's take a look at the conclusion to Sex and Culture and see what Unwin thinks about patriarchy. It is difficult to express any opinion with complete confidence, but as, at the end of my task, I look back along the stream of time, it seems to me that it was the unequal fate of the women, not the compulsory continent, that caused the downfall of absolute monogamy. You see, Unwin sees a women's rights movement as a natural response to a patriarchal society that is biased against women. At no point does he argue for a return to a patriarchal system. He traces the downfall of absolute monogamy to the unequal treatment of women. And this is echoed in Hyposia, which he thinks should have no legal differences between men and women. The fundamental misunderstanding that Black Pigeon has with regards to Unwin's work is that he appears to think that, when arguing for more restrictive sexual norms, Unwin is talking specifically about women. And that's not the case. He's talking about everyone. A patriarchal society is bad for Unwin, not just because it leads to a loss of societal energy, but because it makes it too easy for men to get sex. At one point, he cites the huge number of wives that a king has as a societal weakness. And this brings up another point that's made clear by actually reading Unwin's work. Unwin is talking mainly about the ruling class of our society. He believes it's most important for rulers to be chaste and thus have a lot of energy. And he thinks this attitude will filter down from the ruling class to the masses. In Hyposia, he proposes two tiers of marriage: alpha and beta marriages. Alpha marriages will be unbreakable and for life, and there will be strict punishments for people who are unfaithful. Beta marriages will be more akin to our idea of a modern marriage, less restrictive and with divorce a possibility. Anyone in the society could enter either type of marriage, but only people in alpha marriages could occupy positions of leadership. This is because it was more important for Unwin for the leaders of a society to be chaste than the average person in the street. And speaking of that, to close this video out, I'll just note here that Black Pigeon is a supporter of Donald Trump. And as you're probably aware, a hot mic recording of Donald Trump was recently released in which the married Donald Trump brags about cheating on his then pregnant wife with other people's wives. And I wonder what Unwin would think about that. Well done. You made it to the end of the video. Congratulations. I realized this was a bit of a long one. I'm very sorry. If you'd like to see more videos like this, oh, lights. Everyone always says like and subscribe at the end of these things. I don't understand why that is meant to help me. I mean, it's always nice when people like and subscribe and stuff, but what happens if more people click like versus just not clicking anything? I'm genuinely asking someone write in the comments how that's meant to actually help me out. We've got Twitter, we've got Ask Him. We this Goodbye.